Today's video is about the overhauling of the generator engine, lobe oil purifier, vertical and horizontal shaft. Drain the lobe oil and disconnect all pipes connection. Remove the top cover. Dismantle the ball assembly. Remove the impeller too. Remove the gravity disc. Remove the inlet pipe. Loosen the cap nut and remove. Dismount the ball assembly. Disconnect the water supply connection. Dismount the bowl boss. Dismount the water supply assembly. Dismount the bearing cap 1 and bearing cover 1. Remove the bearing cap 2. Remove the flat spring. Dismount the vertical shaft assembly. Disconnect and remove the motor. Loosen and remove the lock nut and the lock washer. Dismount the friction pulley. Loosen the bolt on the bearing housing 3. Make a match mark on the bearing retainer. Remove the bearing housing 3. Remove the spiral gear. Dismount the horizontal shaft assembly. Use the screw as pushing tool to remove the bearing case 3. Check the dowel condition. And now we have to remove the bearing one by one. Dismount the lower vertical shaft ball bearing 3, the collar, bearing case 3, and bearing 2. Dismount the upper vertical shaft ball bearing 1. Make a match mark before the removal of the ball bearing 1 from bearing case 1. And then mount the new ball bearing into the bearing case 1. Heat up the inner part of the ball bearing. Assemble the bearing into the upper vertical shaft. Mount the lock nut and tighten properly. Remove the ball bearing from the bearing case 2. Dismount the lower vertical shaft bearing adapter sleeve. Heat up the inner bearing adapter sleeve and assemble the adapter sleeve into the lower vertical shaft. Assemble the bearing 2 with bearing case 2. Mount the collar. Heat up the inner part of the ball bearing 3 and assemble into the lower part of the vertical shaft. Mount the bearing case 3 on the lower vertical shaft and check the dowel position. Mount the new oil cell on the bearing housing 4. Mount the new oil cell on the bearing housing 3. Dismount the horizontal shaft ball bearing 1 On the motor side, heat up the inner part of the ball bearing and assemble into the horizontal shaft motor side bearing. Mount the bearing retainer. Mount the new O-ring. Heat up on the inner part of the ball bearing and assemble into the horizontal shaft ball bearing 1 gear side bearing. Mount the cooler 2 and tighten the Allen head screw. Mount the retaining ring. Mount the bearing housing 4. Assemble the horizontal shaft assembly. Mount the spiral gear. Mount the bearing housing 3. Tighten the bearing retainer bolt. Mount the cover and tighten the bolt properly. Mount the shaft key. Mount the friction pulley. Mount the lock nut and tighten properly. Assemble the motor. Fix the bolt and tighten the motor properly. Assemble the bowl assembly. Check the match mark during tightening. Assemble the vertical shaft assembly. Mount the bearing housing 1. Mount the spacer 1. Mount the flat spring. Mount the bearing cap 2. Mount the bearing cover 1. Mount the screw and tighten properly. Mount the bearing cap 1. Mount the water supply assembly. Mount the screw and tighten properly. Tighten the water supply connections. Mount the bowl boss. Tighten the water supply assembly Allen head screw. Check the water supply. Mount the bowl assembly. Tighten the cap nut. Mount the inlet pipe and the impeller 1. Mount the light liquid chamber and tighten properly. Mount the gravity disc. Mount the impeller 2. Mount the heavy liquid chamber and tighten properly. Tighten the spiral gear bolts. Put a new gear oil. Connect all piping connections and tighten properly. And that's all for today's video, guys. Thank you very much for watching.